Welcome to this presentation of the paper Outsourcing Brexit by H.Kassim, my colleague at UEA, and myself, S.Usherwood, here at the University of Surrey. This is a paper which forms part of a panel for the UACES annual conference in Lisbon in September 2019, panel 106, negotiating Article 50. And just to explain that a little bit, this panel is formed of people participating in ESRC-funded Brexit priority grants run by Hussein and myself, which looks at the negotiations in Article 50 in terms of the different member states and the institutions. But one of the things we wanted to do with this panel was to flip the presentation so that here you can get access to the full presentation. But then at Lisbon, we will be providing a shortened version of this talk for each of the papers so that there's much more time for discussion and debate. So if you're joining us in Lisbon, I very much look forward to getting your feedback there on our paper. If you're not able to come to Lisbon, then we will miss you and we'll be thinking of you. But if you want to send any comments, you can contact Hussein or myself through the usual kinds of channels. So with that general introduction, let me talk a little bit more about our paper. One of the things that we think is particularly interesting in this field is the question of the relationship between the European Commission as the lead negotiator on the EU side and the 27. And we wanted to understand why that relationship worked so well, frankly, that we had a certain set of expectations about problems that would exist as the process unrolled. From the start of our project back in at the beginning of Article 50, which haven't been fulfilled at all. So what we wanted to do here is try and think about why that might be. And our central theoretical lens is a use of principal agent models to try and understand how the EU side handled the Article 50 process and more broadly Brexit, but also to, I think, have more of an understanding of how we might elaborate on principal agent relations in an abstract way. Our argument, quite simply put, is that what we would have expected from a principal agent relationship has not happened. That the relationship between the principals, the 27, and the agent has been harmonious, it has been effective, and it has been resilient throughout the entire process of Article 50. And that we see none of the typical features of an agent trying to drift away from the principles, trying to avoid responsibilities, or being captured by external forces. And also, we don't see much evidence of the principals are having difficulty amongst themselves. There's a little bit, but really not nearly as much as you might expect. So what we have here is a situation which is unusual, but which potentially tells us something about how principal-agent relations can be made to work better in an EU context. And also, the research that we've done allows us to actually practically explore the preferences of everyone involved rather than making assumptions, which is typically what happens in the literature. They tend to be black boxed. So I'm going to run through some background about why we think there would have been problems, talk a little bit about the timeline, and then stress where in our analysis we think the resolution of those problems and indeed the avoidance of those problems arising in the first place come about, leading us into some conclusions. As we know, from principal agent modeling, the expectations are typically pessimistic ones. The creation or the empowering of an agent to do work for a principal is driven by a logic of efficiency and effectiveness, that one can create a specialized body or use a specialized body that is better placed to achieve a specific task, is disconnected from wider sets of concerns that might inhibit the principal. And in the case of having multiple principals, it's a much more efficient way of doing things. But at the same time, you also set up tensions whereby we particularly worry about things like agency drift, that the agent develops its own sets of preferences, not least through the development of its own resources and through access to a higher quality and volume of information than that which is available to the principal. That's what it's designed to do. The agent is supposed to have that improved oversight of issues, and so maybe see things in a different kind of way. And so there's often a concern that agents will drift away from the principal's intent and efforts to control and constrain. So as such, we are often thinking here about a relationship that is tense and terse, that's characterized by mutual distrust, that the agent is worried about being controlled and limited and unable to achieve its full potential, whereas the principal is concerned that the agent is trying to escape control and do things on its own terms and potentially even be completely lost to the principal and become completely disconnected. Now, those are general problems in principal-agent approaches. In the case of the EU, we often see further complications and further sets of assumptions that apply, that the Commission is often characterized as being very much more self-aggrandizing than other agents, that it has an institutionalized preference for supranational action and activity, regardless of the situation, which clearly rubs up against the preferences of member states who tend to be more conservative in their reallocation of power. We also have to importantly recognize the Commission has very substantial resources in terms of personnel, in terms of networks of contacts, in terms of information, which allow it to have a degree of autonomy that is not often available to agents. So as an agent, it is a very developed and mature body, which potentially would increase the tension between it and the member states. And that idea of member states is also one that needs a bit of unpacking. We have 27 principals in this case, the other member states of the EU apart from the UK. But each of those, as they are represented in this situation, are themselves agents, that we're actually talking about member state governments who are agents created by parliaments or assemblies to execute national policy. So we actually have a series of nested principal-agent relations, and the more complexity we have, we would expect more opportunity for agents to escape and to play off internal tensions between principals, which allow then the liberation of the agent from all of the different kinds of controls that might be put in place. So our anticipation is that you would expect at a theoretical level that Article 50 would be, despite its novelty, a situation in which these kinds of tensions apply. And yet, at first glance, we see nothing that really backs that up. So to understand that, I just want to run briefly through the phases of Article 50 to date, and then think a little bit about why we don't get these issues coming up in the way that we had thought that they might. The first phase that we need to think about is one that's tends to drop out of sight a bit, but is an important and integral part of Article 50. That the period between May 2015, when we have the results of the British general election, where the Conservatives unexpectedly win their majority, through to the referendum itself, is a point at which we start to see the establishment of activity that is consequential later on. So remember that the British government take a position and a policy of trying to renegotiate terms of membership through the new settlements, which then will be followed by an in-out referendum. Now, that process of renegotiation is largely one that is done between the member states, but with a strong input from the Commission, the creation of a task force. But that task force is clearly aligned with the work of the European Council. So we have already an institutionalization of that relationship between the principal and the agent in the central bodies. And tellingly, at the point that we get that new settlement agreed in the late spring of 2016, we don't see a rolling up or a winding up of that process. That there's a continued set of exchanges between Commission and European Council on a degree of planning and strategizing. There's not involvement in the referendum campaign, but there is preparatory work. So it means that at the point that we move into the second phase, at the point of the referendum, we have the capacity already to create a strong and shared frame between the bodies. So already the day after the referendum, when David Cameron is busy resigning, we have the issuing of a statement from the President of the European Commission, the European Council, and the Presidency, which sets out the broad framework under which the EU frames this issue. And interestingly, that statement is still the frame that we see through to today, that it's very durable, that says the EU is disappointed about the result, but it respects it. It will pursue Article 50 as the way to resolve this, and it has an intention to have a productive future relationship with the UK. That's elaborated in the following week by the first meeting of the European Council in its 27 format, which produces a statement of principles which essentially say the same thing. A key part of this is that the uncertainty about the timeline for UK notification under Article 50 means that the EU operates under an assumed ticking clock, that it doesn't want to be caught without having the necessary structures in place. And it also has a worry that the UK has some secret plan which allows it to very quickly and efficiently engage in bilateral negotiations to take a divide and conquer kind of approach. And because of that, you see a very rapid resolution of some initial discussions about who should be doing what, and ultimately the adoption of something that looks a bit like a trade negotiation model, with the Commission taking the lead on the basis of a negotiation mandate from the EU27, but with a much greater degree of interaction between those two bodies. So even though we see consolidation of institutional structures around the Task Force 50 in the Commission, we have an equivalent body in the European Council, which is a contact point for the member states. And also we have a lot of interactions between those two and involvement of individual member state delegations in Brussels in this process. So already only a month or so after the referendum result, we have the appointment of Michel Barnier as the chief negotiator. So the EU is ready early, and because it's ready early, it's able to start thinking about what it wants to do and is better prepared for the negotiations as it goes along. Now, in practice, that notification comes much later than had been anticipated at the end of March 2017. But because the EU has already been preparing that work, you have a relatively rapid move to producing negotiation directives, their adoption by the European Council, and then their translation into terms of reference for the task force. So whilst this is going on alongside the general election that Theresa May calls in the immediate wake of notification, it means that the concern to use the time as efficiently as possible in that 2-year period means that there's a relatively rapid startup, aided by the fact that both the Commission and the European Council have engaged in extensive pre-discussions about how this will work, so that the difference between the two is ironed out and addressed in an organic way rather than in a big set-piece confrontation. Importantly, the negotiation is in 2 phases, and the negotiating directives are constrained. So that initial negotiation directive that the European Council produces in May 17 is only for phase 1, and it provides for a review by all parties at the point where sufficient progress has been made. Now that takes a bit longer because of UK difficulties, but once that's achieved at the back end of 2017, we then have a relatively rapid move once again to create a revised set of negotiation directives to wrap that process up. But here, all the way through, member states are kept very much in the loop throughout the process. So negotiations might only have the UK and the Commission in the room, but various delegations basically say that they are very happy that they know exactly what's going on, that they are as good as in the room, even if they're not present. So issues are managed in an ongoing basis rather than just with these regular control points. Now, even though we have the blockage of the Salzburg summit, where the UK is anticipated to come with conciliatory language, but instead comes with a stern talking to the EU, we do eventually move into the tunnel. And at that point, we have a reduced set of people interacting, but the confidence that the member states have with the Commission in that process, I think, is quite telling. And they are happy that the Commission will secure their objectives. And ultimately, at the end of November 18, when we have the production of that agreement on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, we see that that is something which member states express uniformly their happiness with one small exception, which I'll come back to, and that of Spain. And that opens the door then to start thinking about what comes next in anticipation of a post-Article 50 phase with the production of a further draft negotiation directive. The final phase that we have then is that period of ratification, which was anticipated to be maybe 3 months or 4 months, and we're now coming up to something more like 9 or 10 months by the time that we'll be talking about this paper in Lisbon. Here, once again, I think it's worth noting the level of coordination between the Commission and the European Council. We have an effort to try and unblock matters, most notably with the the Strasbourg agreement between Jean-Claude Juncker and Theresa May at the beginning of March of 2019, to try and see if there's anything that can be done, the clarifications on text that can be done to help unblock UK ratification. But also the coordination between member states on the first extension, which took place in the middle of March, largely too on the second extension that took place in April, notwithstanding the quite public grandstanding that the French government in particular took. Ultimately, the divergence between member states was not as big as perhaps was portrayed. And again, that's a reflection of the shared approach and preferences that all parties seem to be sharing. So it's very much at the edges that there were differences. So two things to stress in this, again, are that we don't see any evidence of the Commission drifting away from what it's been asked to do or told to do by the member states. We don't see any efforts or evidence of it trying to just not bother, just hope it goes away. The Commission is very actively engaged throughout the process of preparation, negotiation, facilitation of ratification to try and make that work to the member states' interests. And also, I think it's worth stressing that we see very little divergence of preference between the 27 principles. In terms of the negotiating directives, we don't really see anything that is an issue for anybody, largely because those discussions have been had on an ongoing basis, and there is a good understanding by all parties about the needs that need to be met. So that involves a mainstreaming of the concerns of those member states with particular issues, most obviously Ireland, but also those countries that have a close geographical proximity to the UK, who are particularly exposed to the trade effects of Brexit. And where we do see divergence, typically that is managed very efficiently. So the case of Spain raising the issue of Gibraltar at the end of 2018 as part of the ratification process was very quickly pushed back down and referred out into the future relationship talks. So the level to which the Spanish government was willing to actually do anything about it, I think, was quite limited, and also largely explained by the looming general election that was going on there, rather than a real fundamental challenge to what's going on. The other example I think that's worth stressing is that we have one case of Croatia, who are still in transitional arrangements on freedom of movement, who were worried about that process and did note that early on in Article 50, but again, that was something that was taken on board and brought into the negotiations. So again, the key message here is that we don't see what we would expect to see in a principal-agent relationship. So what explains that? How do we understand this effective relationship? 5 thoughts really spring to mind. The first is that the terms of the delegation that takes place is very well defined and is very detailed. The 27 are very explicit in their negotiating mandates about what it is that they are doing. The boundaries of Article 50 are set very tightly, so it's about ending the UK's membership rather than about also establishing the future relationship. So that will go into more conventional trade negotiation that the Commission regularly does on behalf of member states. So here, that definition, that limit, that detail means that there is a clear understanding on both sides between the principal and the agent about what is involved and what the objective might be. You also, importantly, have a high level of control. So that detail of the mandate that is given by the European Council constitutes a strong ex-ante control that says this is what you're trying to do and these are the limits in what you can say and do. But also then those ongoing controls and involvement of member states throughout the process. So in contrast to a normal third country negotiation, where the Commission tends to have a bit more space, a bit more difference, you actually have a lot more involvement and coordination between everybody who's involved. Thirdly, I think we can point to the strong shared frame between member states and the Commission. Brexit's understood here as an existential threat to the EU. It challenges the value of membership for everybody. It raises the question about the future existence of the organisation. And so there's a strong frame around this, which brings the different parties together. And again, that interest, that framing of this is a process that's trying to lead to an orderly withdrawal, it's trying to minimize disruption to the EU, is one which is very present, and actually you still see it clearly today. Fourthly, you have a high level of shared preferences between the principals and the agent. That there is concern to limit any contagion from Brexit into other member states wanting to do the same. There's an effort and a concern to limit the divide and conquer tactics that the British are expected to deploy at various points through the process. That there is strength in unity, and particularly for those countries with particular interests, most obviously Ireland, that concern that they might be cut loose helps reinforce the logic of working together. But also there's a clear shared preference that the EU needs a functional relationship with the UK, however this happens, which means that there is a strong interest in making sure that this stage of the process goes well in order to set things up better for the future relationship. Finally, we might also look at the Commission as an agent. In terms of its preferences, it's actually much less demanding than the 27, that it has been a good negotiating partner for the UK in that it's often acted as an interpreter and a bridge between the 27 and the British government. And so its accommodation of different interests has been one which has allowed it to play a more constructive role than might otherwise be expected. That there's a high level of concern to make sure that member states stay on board, again because of that desire to avoid internal divisions, which mean that its preferences are more openly constructed, let's say, than those of some member states. And also, clearly, the strategy that the Commission takes of one with a high level of disclosure, a high level of transparency in comparison to typical talks. So a lot of briefings, a lot of release of materials, a lot of regular status updates, trying to do that to show good faith, but also to demonstrate how things work and a degree of pedagogy behind it, that a concern that grows within the Task Force 50 team, that British counterparts don't always understand how the EU operates. And so there's a degree of education that's going on in all of this. And the final point is this notion of contingency. The Commission is not only responsible for Article 50, it's also responsible for no-deal contingency planning. So you have a separate team apart from Task Force 50 who are dealing with what happens when the UK stops being a member. And to a certain degree, regardless of how that happens, notwithstanding transitional arrangements, there is a concern to make sure that EU interests are protected. And so having sight of that work alongside the negotiation work clearly allows it to elaborate where issues might be in need of addressing, where there might need to be further discussions and movement. And so there is an interaction between those two parts in the way that there is in the British government as well. So those then, I think, are the key things that we see that explain why this relationship works. However, I think we've got to think about a couple of issues. One, is this a rather over-determined system? Is this just something that would have happened anyway? Do we have we simply just got too many things happening at the same time to be confident about that? That, I think, is a discussion that we still would have, and if people have ideas, we're very happy to hear those. One thing that might be useful here might be to think about some counterfactuals. If the Commission didn't have that proximity to member states through the surveillance and the engagement work that it does with its task force, would it have the same leverage that it did? In terms of establishing negotiating credibility, would it be in the same strong position that it has been throughout Article 50? We might also think about what would happen if there had been a substantial disagreement between member states. Who would have been able to do anything about that? Would that be something that member states would have to sort out themselves collectively? Would larger member states have to intervene, or indeed smaller, acting as honest brokers? Or would the Commission itself have to come back and try and manage that tension? As it is, the absence of substantive disagreement made this very much easier. So, the Spanish example, I think, is the one that comes closest to that, but even then, that's a very limited case. What's interesting is that if we think about the post-Article 50 phase of Brexit, future relationship talks, this issue, I think, will become much more evident because member states have more obviously differentiated opinions about what that future relationship should be like. And then the final counterfactual is, well, if we did this all again with another country, knowing what we know from however Brexit turns out, would we have the same things happening again? There is an argument, which is that just the sheer novelty of this produces exaggerated effects, whereas if this became a more regular occurrence, indeed if it just happened once more, we might potentially see more exploration of the tensions that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So, to conclude, this is a model and an approach which we think brings some value in exploring the particular relationship between the principals and the agents on the EU side. Also, having done work on the UK side, you can see how it might be of use in looking at the relationship between the negotiating team and government, or between government and parliament in the UK side of the negotiations. Also, importantly, I think it tells us something useful about why the EU seems so strong. That we talk a lot about the weakness of British negotiating position and the strength of the EU one. Part of that, a key part of it, is about the successful and harmonious management of that principal-agent relationship. And finally, it's something which comes back to how we talk about principal and agents in EU studies, and we would anticipate that this is something which provides a useful insight, and by better understanding how this can be optimized as a relationship, we might develop some insights that would be of use in other situations. That's me and my bit of the presentation. If you're joining us again in Lisbon, we look very forward to seeing you and discussing with you. If you're not, we look forward to hearing from you as well. If you want to find the other papers and presentations for this panel, if you go on YouTube and you look for Negotiating Brexit Lisbon, those 3 words, then you should find the other papers. In the meantime, I hope you have a great summer, and I'll see you next time.